May 15, 1945, Union Station, Washington. Corporal James Mitchell of the 761st Tank Battalion stood on the platform, his Distinguished Service Cross hidden beneath his olive-drab uniform, watching as German prisoners of war boarded a train bound for a relocation camp in Oklahoma. The prisoners, still wearing their tattered field-gray uniforms with insignia carefully removed, climbed aboard passenger cars with cushioned seats, dining service, and climate control. Mitchell had just returned from 16 months of continuous operations across France and Germany, where his tank crew had been among the first to breach the Siegfried Line. He held orders directing him to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, for reassignment. The irony wasn't lost on him. The men his unit had defeated in battle would ride in comfort, while he, wearing the uniform of victory, would be directed to the segregated cargo section of the same train. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened next would expose a contradiction so profound that it would reach the desk of the Secretary of War, force a reckoning within the military establishment, and become a catalyst for changes that would reshape the American armed forces forever. Mitchell wasn't alone on that platform. Sergeant Robert Hayes of the 92nd Infantry Division stood nearby, his own chest bearing the Silver Star earned during the brutal mountain campaign in Italy. Next to him, Technician 5th Grade William Parker, a combat medic who had treated wounded soldiers of every nationality across 3 countries, shifted his duffel bag from one shoulder to the other. All 3 men had received the same instructions from the ticket office. Proceed to the rear cargo car designated for colored military personnel. The same ticket clerk who had directed them to the cargo section had, moments earlier, personally escorted the German prisoners to the passenger compartments, ensuring they understood the dining car schedule and the location of the lavatory facilities. The 761st Tank Battalion had earned a unit citation for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of the Bulge. Mitchell's crew had held a critical crossroads near Bastogne for 14 hours against repeated assaults, destroying 7 enemy armored vehicles before reinforcements arrived. He had watched 3 members of his crew perish in that action. The medal on his chest represented more than personal valor. It symbolized the contribution of thousands of black soldiers who had demanded the right to fight in combat roles after years of being relegated to service and supply units. Hayes had earned his decoration during the Gothic Line offensive in northern Italy, where the 92nd Division faced some of the most formidable defensive positions in the European theater. The German forces had transformed every ridge, every stone building, every mountain pass into a fortress. Hayes had led his platoon through a minefield under direct observation by enemy forces, reaching an objective that had resisted 3 previous attempts. His citation described actions that met every definition of courage under fire. Parker's service had taken him from the beaches of Normandy through the hedgerows of France to the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley. He had treated soldiers bleeding from wounds inflicted by artillery, small arms, and the 1,000 casual cruelties of mechanized warfare. He had held dying men from Kansas and Kentucky, from Brooklyn and Birmingham, listening to their final words, promising to right their mothers. He had performed the same service for enemy soldiers when battlefield circumstances allowed. The red crosses on his helmet and armband had made him a target on more than one occasion, but he had never abandoned a wounded man, regardless of which uniform the casualty wore. The train conductor, a middle-aged white man named Thomas Brennan, who had worked the southern routes for 23 years, approached the 3 soldiers. Brennan had seen thousands of servicemen pass through Union Station during the war years. He had witnessed the vast mobilization that had transformed American society, moving millions of men and uncountable tons of material across the continental network of rails that connected every city, town, and military installation. He had also witnessed the rigid enforcement of segregation that governed that movement, the invisible but absolute boundaries that determined who sat where, who ate where, who was welcomed and who was merely tolerated. Brennan cleared his throat before speaking. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to navigate contradictions without questioning them too deeply. The prisoner transport had priority boarding, he explained. The German prisoners would occupy cars 3 through 5. The colored section was located in car 12. behind the freight cars carrying military equipment and medical supplies. Mitchell asked about the passenger cars between 6 and 11. Those were reserved for white personnel, military and civilian, Brennan replied. The separation was standard policy on all southern routes, maintained regardless of rank or decoration. Hayes asked a simple question that carried layers of meaning. Were the German prisoners considered white personnel for the purposes of this policy? Brennan hesitated. The prisoners were being transported under military custody, he said. Their accommodations had been arranged by the Provost Marshal's office, according to the requirements of the Geneva Convention, governing the treatment of prisoners of war. The convention specified minimum standards for housing, nutrition, and medical care. It also contained provisions regarding the dignity and respect owed to captured enemy soldiers. Nothing in those provisions addressed the particular circumstances that had placed former enemies in passenger cars, while American soldiers who had defeated them rode in cargo sections. Mitchell noticed something that made the situation even more striking. Among the German prisoners boarding the train was a group of approximately 30 men who appeared notably better fed and better dressed than the others. These men carried themselves with a bearing that suggested they had been officers or senior enlisted personnel before their capture. Their uniforms, though stripped of insignia, showed better tailoring and finer material than the standard field issue. They conversed in low voices, occasionally glancing at the American soldiers on the platform with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that might have been superiority. One of these Germans, a tall man with steel-grey hair and a dueling scar on his left cheek, made direct eye contact with Mitchell. The German's gaze moved from Mitchell's face to the medal on his chest, then to the tank battalion patch on his shoulder, and finally back to Mitchell's eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, not quite recognition but an acknowledgement of sorts. The German had likely commanded armored forces himself. He would have understood what that medal represented, what actions merited such recognition. For a brief instant, Mitchell saw something like respect in the German's expression. Then the man turned away and boarded the passenger car, taking a window seat where he would ride in comfort for the next 36 hours. The cargo car designated for colored military personnel had been designed to transport equipment, not human beings. Wooden benches ran along both walls, installed as an afterthought to accommodate overflow passengers during the peak mobilization years. The car had minimal ventilation, no climate control, and a single chemical toilet behind a canvas curtain at one end. The floor consisted of bare wood planking, scuffed and stained from years of heavy use. The lighting came from 4 bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows and left the corners in near darkness. During summer months, the car became an oven. During winter, it offered little protection from the cold that seeped through gaps in the walls and floor. 23 black servicemen eventually gathered in that cargo car, representing every branch and specialty in the American military. There were infantrymen and artillerymen, engineers and signal corps technicians, quartermasters and military police. Some wore the patches of units that had seen extensive operations overseas. Others belonged to service battalions that had spent the war years moving supplies, building roads, loading ships, and performing the thousands of unglamorous but essential tasks that enabled mechanized warfare on a global scale. Private First Class David Coleman from Philadelphia had served with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, one of the few black combat units to land at Normandy on the first day. His battalion had operated the tethered observation balloons that provided early warning of enemy aircraft and forced hostile planes to higher altitudes where they became less accurate and more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Coleman had spent the invasion under direct observation by enemy forces, vulnerable to artillery fire, knowing that the hydrogen-filled balloons he tended could turn into fireballs if struck by incendiary rounds. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington from Alabama had commanded a gun crew in the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, providing fire support for infantry operations across France and into Germany. His unit had fired more than 15,000 rounds during the war, each mission calculated to provide maximum effect while minimizing risk to friendly forces. Washington could compute firing solutions in his head, adjusting for wind, temperature, powder temperature, barrel wear, and a dozen other variables that determined whether a shell landed on target or fell short among advancing infantry. Technical Sergeant Raymond Hughes from Detroit had served with the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first black fighter unit in American military history. Though he was a ground crew chief rather than a pilot, his expertise had kept the squadron's aircraft operational through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, identifying which cylinder was misfiring or which bearing was wearing out before instruments showed any problem. The pilots trusted him absolutely because they knew their lives depended on his skill and attention to detail. As the train pulled away from Union Station, beginning its journey south through Virginia and the Carolinas toward Georgia and points west, the men in the cargo car settled into an uneasy quiet. They had each made this journey before, navigating the complex geography of segregation that divided America as surely as any border or mountain range. They knew which restaurants would serve them and which would not, which hotels had colored sections and which had none, which towns welcomed black servicemen, and which made them understand they should keep moving. The uniform that commanded respect in some contexts meant nothing in others, and the medals on their chests could not open doors that local custom and law kept closed. Mitchell found himself sitting across from a young private named Thomas Bright, who couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Bright wore the patch of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and the haunted expression of someone who had seen more than any 19-year-old should see. Mitchell asked where he had served. Bright's voice came out flat, drained of emotion by experiences that had carved away everything except the essential facts. His battalion had fought across France and Germany, he said. They had been at the Bulge. They had helped liberate one of the concentration camps in the final weeks of the war. That last detail made Mitchell lean forward with attention. The liberation of the concentration camps had produced some of the war's most disturbing images and revelations, evidence of atrocities that challenged comprehension. What had Bright seen? The young private closed his eyes as if trying to block out the memories. The camp was near a town whose name he couldn't pronounce, he said. The smell had reached them before they could see the place. When they finally entered the gates, they found thousands of prisoners, some barely alive, many already dead. The survivors looked like skeletons covered with skin, wearing striped uniforms that hung loose on their wasted frames. Some could barely walk, others couldn't move at all. Bright's unit had been among the first American forces to reach the camp. They had distributed their own rations to the prisoners, not understanding yet that starving people cannot digest rich food without getting sick. They had called for medical support and began the process of documenting what they found, taking photographs and testimony that would later become evidence in trials. The experience had shaken every member of his unit, forcing them to confront the reality of what they had been fighting against, the ideology that could produce such systematic cruelty. And now, Bright said, the men who had served that ideology were riding in passenger cars with cushioned seats, while American soldiers sat in a cargo hold. Mitchell understood the bitterness in the young man's voice, the sense that something fundamental had been twisted into an ugly paradox. They had crossed an ocean to defeat an enemy whose central belief was the superiority of one race over all others, whose government had codified that belief into laws that stripped millions of people of their humanity and ultimately their lives. And yet, they had returned to a country that maintained its own system of racial hierarchy, less brutal perhaps, but no less absolute, enforced by laws and customs that were explained but never really justified. Hayes joined the conversation, speaking in the measured tones of someone who had thought deeply about these contradictions. He had grown up in Mississippi, he said, where the rules were clear even if the logic behind them never made sense. His father had been a sharecropper, farming land he would never own, settling accounts at harvest time that somehow always left him in debt. His mother had worked as a domestic servant in white households, raising other women's children, while her own made do with whatever time and energy she had left at the end of long days. Hayes had enlisted in 1941, seeing the military as a path towards something better, an institution where merit might matter more than the circumstances of birth. The military had proven both better and worse than he expected, Hayes continued. Better because it had given him opportunities for leadership and recognition that civilian life would have denied. Worse because it had imported civilian prejudices into its ranks, creating a parallel system of segregation that undermined the very principles the military claimed to defend. The 92nd Division had fought with distinction in Italy, but their accomplishments had been minimized or ignored in official accounts that preferred to focus on other units. They had proven themselves in every meaningful measure of military effectiveness, and yet they remained suspect, their abilities questioned, their loyalty assumed rather than acknowledged. Parker added his own observations from his unique perspective as a medic. Blood was blood, he said simply. A wound was a wound, regardless of the skin that surrounded it. He had treated hundreds of casualties during his time overseas, and he had never once looked at a wounded man and thought about anything except how to keep him alive. The human body under stress revealed itself in universal ways. Pain, fear, shock, the desperate will to survive. These things transcended every artificial boundary that society constructed. And yet even in medical facilities, segregation persisted. Hospitals maintained separate wards for colored personnel. Blood supplies were segregated according to the race of the donor, as if the fluid that carried oxygen and nutrients somehow differed in essential ways depending on the person from whom it came. The absurdity of it struck Parker every time he confronted it. They could mix blood plasma from 1,000 donors of different races without any adverse effect, but military policy required maintaining separate inventories, separate records, separate everything. The conversation expanded to include others in the car. Coleman described the reaction of French civilians to Black American soldiers, the surprise and often the warmth they encountered from people who had no investment in American racial categories. French families had invited him into their homes, shared what little food they had, treated him as a liberator without qualification or reservation. French women had danced with black soldiers at liberation celebrations without scandal or controversy. The contrast with American attitudes had been stark and impossible to ignore. Washington talked about the German prisoners his unit had processed during their advance across Germany. Some had been arrogant and defiant, clinging to their ideology even in defeat. Others had been relieved to be captured, exhausted by years of warfare that had consumed their country and their futures. A few had been surprisingly willing to talk, to explain how they had been drawn into service, how the promises of their government had given way to the reality of total war. What struck Washington most was how ordinary most of them seemed, how unremarkable. They were farmers and factory workers, clerks and craftsmen, people who had been swept up in events larger than themselves. And those men, Washington pointed out, were riding in passenger cars, while the soldiers who had captured them sat in cargo holds. The policy made sense from a narrow legalistic perspective. The Geneva Convention required certain standards of treatment for prisoners of war, but it made no sense from any other angle. It certainly made no sense to the men whose service and sacrifice had secured the victory that made prisoner transport necessary in the first place. Hughes raised a point that had been troubling him since he witnessed the boarding process at Union Station. The German prisoners were being treated according to international law, he said. That was appropriate and necessary. America claimed to be fighting for certain principles, certain values that included the rule of law and respect for human dignity. Those principles didn't stop applying just because the people in question were enemies. But why didn't those same principles extend to American citizens, to soldiers who had volunteered to serve their country, who had proven their worth in the most demanding circumstances imaginable? The question hung in the air, unanswerable because the answer was too obvious and too uncomfortable. The prisoners received better treatment than black American soldiers because the prisoners were white and the soldiers were not. The law that governed the treatment of prisoners recognized their humanity without qualification. The law that governed American society qualified that recognition, dividing people into categories that determined their rights and their treatment, their opportunities and their limitations. As the train continued south, passing through the Virginia countryside where spring was giving way to early summer, Mitchell noticed changes in the landscape that reflected the region's history and its ongoing transformation. They passed farms that had been worked by enslaved people before the war between the states, land that had been fought over during that earlier conflict, towns that had been burned and rebuilt. They passed factories that had been constructed during the recent war years, converting from civilian production to military manufacturing, and now beginning the process of converting back. They passed training camps where millions of men had learned to be soldiers, installations that would soon be downsized or closed as the military contracted to peacetime levels. The industrial mobilization that had enabled victory had transformed the American economy in profound ways. Production had reached levels that would have seemed impossible before the war. In 1944 alone, American factories had produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Shipyards had launched ships faster than enemy forces could sink them, producing vessels in weeks that previously would have taken months or years. The logistics network had moved millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles of ocean, sustaining forces operating on multiple continents simultaneously. That mobilization had required the participation of all Americans, regardless of race. Black workers had found employment in defense industries that had previously excluded them, taking jobs in shipyards and aircraft factories, steel mills and munitions plants. Black women had joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working alongside white women in factories that desperately needed labor. The migration from rural South to industrial North and West had accelerated, beginning a demographic shift that would reshape American cities and politics for generations. But the social changes that accompanied economic mobilization remained incomplete and contested. Factories might hire black workers, but they often maintained separate facilities and limited promotional opportunities. Housing near defense plants remained segregated, leading to overcrowding and tension. The military might accept black volunteers, but it channeled them into separate units under white officers, maintaining boundaries that reinforced existing hierarchies even as circumstances demanded cooperation. Mitchell had experienced these contradictions personally. His tank battalion had trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky, learning to operate the M5 Stuart light tank and later the M4 Sherman medium tank. The training had been rigorous and professional, preparing them for the demands of armored warfare. But they had trained in segregated facilities, eating in separate mess halls, sleeping in separate barracks, using separate recreational facilities. Their white instructors had ranged from professional and respectful to openly hostile and dismissive. Some genuinely wanted to prepare them for success. Others seemed to expect failure and interpreted every difficulty as confirmation of their prejudices. When the battalion had finally deployed overseas in October 1944, they had been assigned to support operations in France and later Germany. Their first significant action had come during the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counteroffensive that had caught American forces by surprise and threatened to split Allied lines. The battalion had been rushed to the front, moving through snow and ice in temperatures that made metal painful to touch, arriving at positions where the situation remained fluid and dangerous. Mitchell's crew had consisted of 5 men who had trained together, fought together, and saved each other's lives repeatedly. The tank commander, Sergeant Leon Davis from Chicago, had possessed an uncanny ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements. The gunner, Corporal Ernest Wilson from New York, could place shells on target with precision that amazed even veteran artillery observers. The loader, Private Samuel Green from Louisiana, could maintain a rate of fire that kept their gun active when other crews had fallen behind. The driver, Private Howard Nelson from Ohio, could coax their Sherman through mud, snow, and obstacles that would have stopped less skilled operators. Together they had formed a crew that functioned with the precision and coordination that came from absolute trust and shared experience. They had destroyed enemy armored vehicles, supported infantry assaults, held defensive positions against attacks that should have overwhelmed them. They had done everything that any tank crew in any army could be expected to do, and they had done it without the recognition or support that white crews received as a matter of course. Davis had been killed during the action that earned Mitchell his medal, struck by shrapnel when an enemy shell penetrated their tank's turret. Green had died 2 days later when their tank struck a mine during a movement to a new position. The explosion had torn through the floor, killing him instantly and severely wounding Nelson, who lost his left leg below the knee. Wilson had survived physically intact, but had been evacuated with what the medical reports called combat fatigue, the psychological trauma that came from too many close calls, too many losses, too much exposure to the lottery of violence that was armored warfare. Mitchell had survived with minor wounds and major memories, experiences that would return unbidden in moments of quiet, images and sounds that wouldn't fade no matter how much time passed. He carried the weight of their loss, the knowledge that he had lived while better men had died, the burden that survivors always carried, regardless of how irrational it might be. And now he rode in a cargo car, while prisoners rode in comfort, and the irony of that made something hard and angry form in his chest. The train made its first stop in Richmond, Virginia, taking on water and fuel for the locomotives. Passengers were allowed to disembark for 20 minutes to stretch their legs and use the station facilities. The German prisoners filed off their cars, guarded by military police but otherwise moving freely. They walked along the platform, looking at the station architecture, commenting among themselves in their language. Several entered the station restaurant, where they were served coffee and sandwiches. Mitchell and the other black soldiers remained in their car. Station regulations prohibited colored personnel from using the main facilities. There was a colored waiting room on the far side of the building, accessible through a separate entrance, but the 20-minute stop didn't allow time to reach it and return before the train departed. So they stayed where they were, watching through the gaps in the car's walls as others enjoyed privileges denied to them. Bright voiced what several others were thinking. They should file a complaint through official channels, document the disparate treatment, force someone in authority to acknowledge and address the situation. But Hayes shook his head, his expression conveying the exhaustion of someone who had fought that battle before. Complaints would be received, he said, acknowledged with official courtesy, and then filed away without action. The military had regulations covering such matters, procedures for addressing grievances, but those procedures moved slowly when they moved at all, and they rarely produced meaningful change. Parker offered a different perspective. Change would come, he suggested, but it would come slowly, driven by forces larger than individual complaints or incidents. The war had changed America in fundamental ways that were only beginning to become apparent. Millions of black Americans had served in uniform, proving their capabilities in every role the military allowed them. Millions more had worked in defense industries, demonstrating their skills and reliability. The generation that had fought overseas would not accept the limitations their parents had endured. They had seen too much, done too much, proven too much to go back to the old accommodations. Moreover, Parker continued, the world had changed. America now positioned itself as the leader of the free world, the defender of democracy against totalitarian alternatives. That position became harder to maintain when the country practiced its own forms of discrimination and segregation. International opinion mattered in ways it hadn't before the war. The contradiction between American ideals and American practices had become a vulnerability that adversaries could exploit and that allies could not ignore. Washington added his own analysis, drawing on his understanding of military organization and politics. The military establishment had powerful institutional reasons to resist integration, he acknowledged. Segregation had been military policy since the founding of the Republic, with only brief exceptions during periods of desperate need. Senior officers had built their careers within that system and had no incentive to dismantle it. Many genuinely believed that integration would undermine unit cohesion and military effectiveness, despite all evidence to the contrary. But the military also responded to political pressure and practical necessity. The costs of maintaining parallel structures for every function and facility strained budgets and efficiency. The performance of black units during the war had demonstrated capabilities that undermined the rationale for segregation. And the political coalition that had supported segregation was beginning to fracture as demographics shifted and as younger voters demanded change. The conversation continued as the train resumed its journey, moving deeper into the South, where the architecture of segregation became even more elaborate and entrenched. At each stop, the same pattern repeated. Prisoners disembarked and used station facilities. Black soldiers remained in their car or used separate inferior facilities when available. The guards who supervised the prisoners treated them with courtesy and even deference. The railroad personnel who interacted with the black soldiers treated them with indifference at best and hostility at worst. In South Carolina, at a stop in a small town whose name Mitchell didn't catch. Something happened that crystallized the absurdity of the situation. One of the German prisoners, a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s, approached the cargo car where the black soldiers sat. He carried a package of cigarettes and a canteen of coffee. Through broken English, supplemented with gestures, he made clear that he wanted to share with them. The gesture created an awkward moment. Mitchell and the others weren't sure how to respond. Was this pity? Charity? An attempt at reconciliation? The young German seemed earnest, his expression suggesting genuine goodwill rather than condescension. Hayes finally accepted the offering, and the German smiled with evident relief. He said something in his language, then tried again in English. "You are good soldiers. It is not right." Then he returned to his car before the guards noticed his absence. That small interaction carried more weight than it should have. Here was someone who had recently been shooting at American forces, offering kindness to American soldiers. Meanwhile, the systems and institutions of their own country continued to treat them as second-class citizens, unworthy of the basic dignity afforded to former enemies. The contradiction cut deep, exposing wounds that military service was supposed to heal, but instead had made more painful. As night fell and the train continued westward, the men in the cargo car tried to make themselves comfortable enough to sleep. The wooden benches offered little padding and no room to stretch out. Those who had blankets shared with those who didn't. They arranged themselves as best they could, using duffel bags as pillows, finding positions that might allow a few hours of fitful rest. Mitchell found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. His mind kept returning to the past months, reviewing the experiences that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the first time his crew had engaged enemy armor, the terrifying intensity of that encounter, the realization that all their training had been preparation for moments of chaos and violence that no training could fully anticipate. He thought about Davis's last words, a joke about a girl back home, spoken moments before the shell hit. He thought about Green's parents in Louisiana, and the letter he had written them, trying to explain how their son had died bravely serving his country, knowing that the Army's official notification would be cold and bureaucratic. He thought about the German he had locked eyes with on the platform in Washington, and wondered what battles that man had fought, what losses he had endured, what thoughts now occupied his mind as he rode in comfort toward an uncertain future. The German was a defeated enemy, but he remained a soldier, and there was a recognition between soldiers that transcended the causes they served. They understood each other in ways that civilians could never understand, having shared the experience of organized violence, having seen what human beings could do to each other when nations mobilized their full resources for destruction. But that recognition, that mutual understanding, didn't extend to the larger society. The German would eventually be repatriated, would return to whatever remained of his country, would rebuild his life with the assistance of recovery programs designed to create stability in post-war Europe. Mitchell would return to a country that had rigid boundaries around where he could live, what schools his future children could attend, what opportunities would be available or denied. Victory had been achieved, but the peace that followed would not bring equality. Somewhere around midnight, the train made an unscheduled stop. The cause wasn't immediately clear, possibly a mechanical issue, possibly some problem with the track ahead. The stop stretched from minutes into hours as the crew worked to resolve whatever had gone wrong. Passengers grew restless and uncomfortable. The German prisoners remained in their cars, guarded but calm. The black soldiers in the cargo car simply waited, used to delays and disruptions, accustomed to situations they couldn't control. During that long wait, Coleman told a story that several others had heard before, but that bore retelling. On the 6th of June, 1944, his unit had landed at Normandy as part of the initial invasion force. Their barrage balloons had been among the first equipment brought ashore, established even as combat engineers worked to clear obstacles and as infantry units pushed inland. Coleman's balloon had been positioned near Omaha Beach, where the landing had met the fiercest resistance, where casualties had been highest, where the outcome had remained in doubt until late in the day. For 3 days, Coleman and his crew had operated their balloon under constant threat. Enemy artillery had targeted the balloons, correctly identifying them as important equipment worth destroying. Enemy aircraft had strafed positions near the beach, during the few opportunities they had to penetrate Allied air cover. Coleman had watched soldiers die all around him, had seen the beach turn red with blood, had witnessed courage and terror in equal measure. And when it was over, when the beachhead was secured and the breakthrough had begun, his unit had received minimal recognition. The history books would remember other units, other beaches, other achievements. The 320th would be a footnote at best, their contribution acknowledged but not celebrated, their service accepted but not appreciated. Yet Coleman spoke without bitterness, describing the experience as something he was proud to have been part of despite the lack of recognition. He had been there, he said. He had done his duty. He had helped achieve a victory that would shape the future of the world. The fact that his country didn't fully acknowledge his contribution didn't change what he had accomplished or what he knew himself to be capable of achieving. That attitude, that determination to claim dignity regardless of whether it was granted, represented something powerful and important. It was a refusal to internalize the limitations others tried to impose, a commitment to self-worth that didn't depend on external validation. Mitchell recognized it because he felt it himself, that stubborn insistence on being fully human, even in circumstances designed to diminish humanity. The train finally resumed movement sometime before dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten when they crossed into Georgia, entering the heart of the Deep South, where the rules of segregation were most rigid and most rigorously enforced. The landscape became more rural, pine forests and red clay fields, small towns connected by roads that wound through countryside that had changed little in decades. At a stop in Atlanta, the largest city on the route, the situation reached a crisis point that would force a confrontation. The station had separate facilities for colored passengers, but those facilities were located far from the platform where the train had stopped. Black soldiers who wanted to use the restrooms or get food would need to leave the secure area of the platform, potentially missing the train's departure. Meanwhile, the German prisoners were allowed to use the main station facilities without restriction. A young lieutenant, fresh from officer training and new to his assignment, escorting the prisoner transport, made a decision that would have consequences he didn't anticipate. His name was William Bradford, from Massachusetts, and he had grown up in an environment where segregation was less overt than in the South, though no less real in its effects. Bradford felt uncomfortable with the disparate treatment he was witnessing, and he decided to exercise his authority to address it. He approached the cargo car where the black soldiers sat and announced that he was granting them permission to use the main station facilities during the stop. They were American soldiers who had served with distinction, he said, and they deserved to be treated with the respect their service had earned. He would take responsibility for any issues that arose from this decision. The soldiers in the car exchanged glances, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting this offer. Hayes spoke for the group, thanking the lieutenant for his gesture, but explaining the reality of the situation. Local law enforcement wouldn't recognize the lieutenant's authority to override Georgia's segregation statutes. If black soldiers attempted to use white facilities, they would be arrested regardless of their uniforms or the lieutenant's permission. The resulting confrontation would delay the train, create an incident that would reflect badly on all involved, and ultimately change nothing. Bradford, to his credit, listened to this explanation and understood that his good intentions were insufficient to overcome the structural reality of segregation. He was angry. Mitchell could see it in the flush that colored his face, the tension in his shoulders. But his anger was directed at the system rather than at the soldiers who had to navigate it. The lieutenant apologized for his inability to change the situation, then returned to his duties supervising the prisoner transport. But something had shifted. The incident, small as it was, represented a crack in the wall of indifference and acceptance that usually surrounded segregation. Bradford had seen the injustice and had been moved to act, even if his action proved ineffective. That mattered because change would require people in positions of authority to recognize injustice and choose to oppose it even when opposition carried costs. The train left Atlanta and continued westward across Georgia and into Alabama. Mitchell watched the landscape pass, the miles accumulating, the distance from the war zones of Europe growing with each hour. He was heading toward Fort Benning, where he would receive new orders, possibly assignment to occupation forces in Japan or Europe, possibly discharge and return to civilian life. He didn't know which outcome to hope for. The military had given him opportunities and experiences that civilian life never would have offered, but it had also subjected him to humiliations and limitations that wore at his spirit. What would civilian life even look like? He had left Detroit more than 3 years ago as a young man who worked in an automobile factory, assembling components on a production line. The factory had been converted to military production during the war, building tanks instead of cars. Would it convert back? Would his old job still exist? Would the skills he had learned in the military translate to civilian employment? Or would he be starting over from the beginning? And what about the promise of the post-war world, the vision of prosperity and opportunity that had been sold to servicemen as part of the reason they were fighting? Would that promise extend to black veterans, or would it be distributed according to the same discriminatory patterns that had governed pre-war society? The GI Bill offered benefits for education and housing, but would those benefits be accessible to all veterans equally, or would they be administered in ways that preserved existing hierarchies? These questions didn't have clear answers, and Mitchell knew that the answers would emerge over years, not days. But he also knew that the men around him, the soldiers who had served and sacrificed, would not accept a return to the pre-war status quo. They had proven themselves in every meaningful way. They had fought for ideals of democracy and freedom. They would insist that those ideals be applied to them as well. The train reached its destination in Oklahoma 2 days after leaving Washington. The journey had covered more than 1,300 miles, crossing through 9 states, passing through dozens of cities and towns. The German prisoners disembarked first, forming into orderly ranks under the supervision of military police, beginning the process of being transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp, where they would remain until repatriation could be arranged. Mitchell and the other black soldiers gathered their equipment and prepared to continue to their respective destinations. Some would leave the train here. Others would continue westward or southward to other installations. They said their farewells, exchanging addresses, promising to stay in touch, knowing that the bonds formed through shared experience would endure even as circumstances separated them. Before they dispersed, Hayes made a suggestion that the others immediately endorsed. They should document what they had experienced, he said. They should write detailed accounts of the journey, noting dates and locations, recording the disparate treatment they had witnessed and experienced. They should submit these accounts to their chain of command, to their congressional representatives, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who might have the authority or influence to address the situation. Individual accounts might be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding, Hayes acknowledged, but multiple accounts from credible witnesses, soldiers with distinguished service records and commendations, would be harder to ignore. The weight of accumulated testimony might force official acknowledgement and response. Even if immediate change didn't result, the documentation would create a record, evidence that could be used by future advocates working toward reform. Mitchell agreed to coordinate the effort, collecting accounts from those who were willing to participate and ensuring they reached appropriate recipients. It was a small action, insufficient to address the larger injustice, but it was something they could do, a way to assert agency in a situation that otherwise left them powerless. What none of them knew at that moment was that their accounts would indeed reach officials who had the authority to act. Within weeks, the accumulated testimony from dozens of similar incidents involving hundreds of soldiers who had experienced disparate treatment during transportation would land on the desk of Secretary of War Robert Patterson. Patterson, who had his own distinguished service record from an earlier war, would be troubled by what he read. The accounts documented a pattern of treatment that contradicted everything America claimed to stand for. Soldiers who had served with distinction, who wore the uniform of the United States military, who carried decorations earned through courage and sacrifice, were being treated worse than captured enemy prisoners. The contradiction was indefensible, the injustice undeniable. Patterson would order an investigation into military transportation policies, examining the regulations and practices that had produced such outcomes. The investigation would reveal that the disparate treatment resulted from a complex interaction of military regulations, civilian law, and entrenched custom. Military authorities claimed they were bound by the segregation laws of states through which trains passed. Railroad companies claimed they were following both civilian law and military directives. Everyone pointed to someone else as the source of the problem, and no one claimed the authority or responsibility to fix it. But Patterson would reject these excuses. The military had the authority to set standards for how its personnel were treated, he would argue, and those standards should reflect the principles for which the military fought. The inconsistency of treating enemy prisoners better than American soldiers was unacceptable, regardless of what local laws or customs might dictate. Change would be necessary, and he would use his authority to begin implementing that change. The process would be slow and incomplete. Orders would be issued requiring equal treatment of all military personnel during transportation, but those orders would face resistance and would be imperfectly enforced. Railroad companies would cite practical difficulties and legal concerns. Local authorities would resist federal intervention into what they considered state matters. Military commanders would vary in their willingness to confront established practices, but the orders would establish a precedent, a recognition that the existing system was unjust and unacceptable. They would empower individual soldiers to demand better treatment and would give sympathetic officers the authority to support those demands. They would begin a process of change that would accelerate over the following years as pressure for reform built from multiple directions. Mitchell would learn about these developments months later, after he had been discharged and had returned to Detroit to begin rebuilding his civilian life. He would read about Patterson's orders in the black press, which covered such developments more thoroughly than mainstream newspapers. He would feel a complicated mix of satisfaction and frustration. Satisfaction that the issue had received official attention, frustration that change remained incomplete, and that so many soldiers would continue to experience injustice while policies were debated and gradually reformed. He would also learn through letters from men he had met during that train journey how their lives were unfolding in the post-war world. Hayes would use his GI Bill benefits to attend college, becoming one of the first members of his family to receive higher education. He would eventually become a teacher, dedicating himself to educating young people and preparing them to navigate and challenge the world's injustices. Coleman would return to Philadelphia and find work in construction, using his military experience with engineering principles to advance into supervisory roles that would have been closed to him before the war. Parker would face a more difficult transition. The things he had witnessed as a combat medic, the injuries he had treated, the deaths he had been unable to prevent, would haunt him for years. He would struggle with what later generations would call post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that made normal life challenging, but he would eventually find healing through connecting with other veterans, through telling his story and hearing theirs, through the recognition that his experiences, however painful, had meaning and value. Washington would become active in veterans organizations and civil rights groups, using his organizational skills and his credibility as a decorated soldier to advocate for change. He would participate in campaigns to integrate schools, challenge housing discrimination, and expand voting rights. He would live to see many of the changes he fought for, though not all, and he would continue working for justice until his death at the age of 73. Hughes would return to Detroit and eventually start his own automotive repair shop, building a successful business through skill and reputation. He would employ other veterans when possible, creating opportunities for men who faced discrimination from other employers. His shop would become a gathering place for veterans, a space where they could share experiences and support each other through the challenges of civilian life. Bright, the youngest of the group, would find his path more slowly and with more difficulty. The things he had seen in the concentration camp would mark him permanently, creating wounds that time would diminish but never fully heal. He would work various jobs, never settling into a career, moving frequently as restlessness and memories drove him from place to place. But he would eventually find stability through marriage and family, discovering that building something positive could help counterbalance the darkness he had witnessed. And Bradford, the young lieutenant who had tried and failed to challenge segregation during that train journey, would go on to have a military career that eventually gave him the authority to implement the changes he had believed in as a junior officer. He would retire as a colonel, having spent his later years working on integration and equal opportunity programs within the military. He would remain in contact with several of the men from that train, including Hayes, maintaining friendships that transcended the racial boundaries that society imposed. The broader changes that these individual stories reflected would accelerate in 1948, when President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9871, mandating equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. The order would face resistance from military leadership and would take years to implement fully, but it would represent a decisive break with the policy of segregation that had governed the military since its founding. The Korean conflict that began in 1950 would see integrated units fighting together, demonstrating that the fears about integration undermining military effectiveness had been unfounded. These changes in military policy would, in turn, influence civilian society. Veterans who had served in integrated units would question why civilian society maintained boundaries that the military had abandoned. The legal strategies developed to challenge military segregation would inform later challenges to civilian segregation. The precedent of federal authority overriding state practices in military contexts would provide a template for broader federal intervention in civil rights. The train journey that Mitchell and his fellow soldiers endured in May of 1945 represented a moment in a much longer struggle, a struggle that had been going on for generations and would continue for generations more. Their decision to document their experience, to insist that the injustice be acknowledged and addressed, contributed to a momentum for change that drew strength from countless similar acts of resistance and assertion. The irony that had been so stark on that platform in Washington, German prisoners receiving better treatment than American soldiers, had exposed a contradiction that could not be easily explained away or justified. It had forced people to confront the gap between American ideals and American practices, between the principles invoked to justify the war and the realities that governed daily life. Mitchell would reflect on these matters often in the years that followed. He would think about the men he had served with, the battles he had fought, the price that had been paid for victory. He would think about Davis and Greene, who had not lived to see the peace their service had helped achieve. He would wonder what they would think of the changes that were slowly, painfully, emerging from the ashes of war. He would also think about that young German prisoner who had shared his cigarettes and coffee, and about the moment of recognition with the older German on the platform in Washington. War had made them enemies, but it had also revealed their common humanity, their shared capacity for courage and suffering, hope and fear. The ideology that had justified the war, the belief in the superiority of one group over another, had proven itself false in the most devastating way possible. And yet versions of that ideology persisted, adapted to different contexts, maintained through different mechanisms. The fight against such ideologies would continue, Mitchell understood, because the human tendency toward division and hierarchy was deeply rooted and persistently expressed. But the capacity for resistance was equally rooted, equally persistent. Every person who refused to accept injustice, who insisted on dignity and equality, who worked to create a more just world, contributed to a momentum that eventually overcame even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Mitchell's contribution had been small in the grand scheme of things. He had served his country, documented an injustice, and tried to live according to his principles. But small contributions accumulated, creating currents of change that eventually became irresistible. The arc of history that later thinkers would describe as bending toward justice bent because people like Mitchell pushed it in that direction, not with grand gestures but with consistent pressure, not with certainty of success but with commitment to trying. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.